What's cooking, friends? My name is Ethan Cook, and I am a minister of encouragement with Campus 180 Ministries. I've had different people asking me if they could hear what we're talking about in our Bible studies that we've got going on, and so I'm here to do that. Last fall, I started a Bible study mostly with college students, and we were going through the book of Mark. Mark is the shorter of the synoptic, meaning the first three Gospels. And it is fast paced, and I love it. We can learn a lot about Jesus. And so there's three things in our Bible study, three questions that we ask every time we read a passage. And so we're going to be in Mark chapter 8 today. And the questions that we ask are, and I didn't come up with these questions, I learned them from my pastor when I was living in Minneapolis. So the first question is, are there any questions? Maybe there's a word you don't know. Maybe there's a city and you're not sure where that's at. Maybe you're not sure of what is being talked about or the context. And so the first question is, do I have any questions? The second question that we like to ask is, before we think about application or what can I learn from this, the second thing we want to focus on is, what can we learn about God? Or in the New Testament, in this passage, what can we learn about Jesus, his character, his actions, his priorities, his concerns? What can we learn about him? And then the third question is there, and if there is, what is the take home? What is the thing I could learn from that passage and apply to my life? What is in that passage just encouraging me as I go through a certain part of life? And so those are the three questions that we've been going through in our Bible study. Now, we want to feed the students and have a Bible study, but we want to do more than just that. Our goal is, with our online Bible study, we still want to have that community. Normally, you go to a Bible study, you chit-chat, you're rubbing shoulders with people in person, and you can talk to them afterwards, and it's not the same online. So the two questions I had this week, today, was, what was the highlight of your week? Or since we saw you last, what's the highlight? We want to talk about positive and encouraging things. So let's focus on those positive things. So different people shared things. For me, I'll answer that question. For me, I am a campus minister, and we had an in-person retreat this last weekend, and that was the highlight of my week. I love being able to spend just about 2 days and 2 nights with young adults. Normally we get an hour here and an hour there, but as a minister, when you get to just hang out with and invest in for more than an hour here and there, it's refreshing. And so that was the highlight of my week, just being involved in our retreat, talking to students about spiritual things, about life, about relationships, about what the gospel was and how to share it. And anyway, that was the highlight for me. The second question is, I want to dig a little deeper in the second question that I come up with each week. And today it was, share a time that you had helped someone in need. And I think I worded it as, share a time that you had to or got to serve or help someone that was in need. It didn't have to be the most recent time, but for you listening and watching this on YouTube, I hope that the last time you helped someone in need wasn't long, long ago. So we had a student share how they were, a few years back, they were involved in a youth group, and that youth group went to downtown Denver, Colorado, and they got to feed the homeless people, an obvious need, and they were able to meet that physical need. Another person shared that they had a friend that just hit rock bottom with rough times in life. And despite their differences and disagreements they had in the past, they still knew that they could come to this student of mine when they really needed help, when no one else was there. They knew they could come to her, and she helped them and has seen some progress. Another student shared how they've got an infant that they see, and that infant somehow got involved in some broken glass and got cut in the head, and they were able to help their niece, I think, or nephew, the nephew. They were able to help them in that time of need. Now, I've got some that are more recent, but I didn't want to share those with the college students because they'd already heard some of those. So I decided I'd share one that I did when I was their age. So I'm in college. I'm at a transfer from a Christian school to a non-Christian school, and I was reading my Bible, and I needed more spiritual food than that to stay a healthy Christian. So I got involved in a church and a Bible study. And at this church, I was only there maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and it was in the fall, and they said, we need some help. There's a family in our church that's farmers, and they've got a frost coming up, and they need help. Anyone that could come tomorrow morning, it was like 7 a.m. or it might even been earlier than that. Yeah, we need help. And immediately I'm sitting in the church going, well, I hope someone helps them. And I felt convicted to say, well, I'm a college student. I don't want to get up that early on a Saturday or Monday morning or whatever it was. I don't want to do that, but I can. I have energy. I've got time. As a college student, those are some of my biggest resources. And so I went and I got there early, and I sat on the wagon of a tractor and sorted snakes and rocks and good potatoes and rotten potatoes all day until dark. And I got to help them. They wanted to pay me, and I said, no, that's not what I'm here for, right? I'm here to serve those in need. So we asked that question specifically because we're going to see a need in our passage today. Because I should share my screen a little bit. We're going to see a need in our passage in Mark chapter 8. And we're going to see how Jesus met the need, but also helped his disciples catch a little bit of why and how and what to do when there's a need. And so we are in Mark chapter 8. We've got students that bring different Bible translations with us, and today one of them had the New Living Translation, and so I went with that, and so that's what's on the screen right now. Jesus feeds 4,000, Mark chapter 8. I'm going to go ahead and read that. We're going to read verses 1 through 10. About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance. His disciples replied, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? Jesus asked, how much bread do you have? 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and he broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. Verse 7, a few small fish were found too. So Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of something I probably can't pronounce, Dalmanutha. All right, so this is the passage. First, don't ever feel guilty or ashamed if you can't pronounce something. I got my theology degree, my master's of theological studies, and I still can't pronounce some of the words, so don't let that bug you down. So we started with the first question. Do you have any questions? Or did anything stick out to you? Anything initially before we look into it? And one of us mentioned this word right here. We got... Again, about this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Again? What does that mean? Well, in chapter 6, Jesus is out in the wilderness and feeds 5,000, and the disciples were a part of that. And now, in chapter 8, there's 4,000 men, and again, at this time, they counted the men. Was it only men? Were there men and women and children? We don't know. We assume there was more than just men. So there's at least 4,000 people present. And so that someone just pointed out that the word again, like, wow, this has already happened. There's not a lot of We didn't have a lot of other questions initially. There's not a lot of confusion. This is more of a straightforward passage. So the second question we want to ask is, what can we learn about Jesus? What can we learn about God in this passage? So some of the things that were brought up was Jesus cares about people, right? It says in verse 2, quoting Jesus, I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days and have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance. So he is not just concerned about their spiritual well-being or their destination in the afterlife. He's concerned about them in their physical bodies, in the here and now, like right in the present. And he has the emotional intelligence to realize these guys have been out in the wilderness for 3 days, and they've come a long distance. So I don't know about you, but if I got my family and I'm traveling into the wilderness for 3 days, I'm going to have a gallon of water for each person. That's your standard camping checklist per day. For 3 days for my family, well, that's a family of 4, so I'm going to need meat, some kind of bread or carbs, how do you get vegetables? Am I going to have canned food? All this stuff we've got here. These people just went off and were so intrigued about this man named Jesus that they were willing to go into the wilderness, not just for an hour. Those of us that complain about a church service going past noon, imagine being so intrigued, so curious about this gentleman that's healing people and sharing the good news and telling parables, and you would follow him for 3 days. Just picture the atmosphere here, that you'd be willing to follow him into the wilderness just to be near him, just to find out more about this guy that's shaking up everything. So that's something we could learn about him, is he has compassion. Another thing someone mentioned was, what else can we learn about Jesus? Well, he always asks questions, right? So we pointed out that Jesus could have been like, oh, they're hungry? Boom, everyone's got a Big Mac fry and a Coke, right? Like he could have used his magic. He could have pulled it out of thin air. He's about to use magic anyway, right? He's going to turn 7 loaves into enough for 4,000. He's about to do magic. He could have gone like that and just boom. But he didn't. And instead, he's teaching the disciples something. He's always teaching. He's always strategic about what he does and what he asks. So his disciples respond in verse 4, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? So I told you what it would be for my family of 4 to have enough food to eat in the wilderness for 3 days. Plus I want a tent, sleeping bag, clothes. Think about it. These people are just out there listening and learning from him for 3 days. That's just crazy to think about. But we learned that he realized that they needed food. He realized their physical need. And the disciples they question him. Now, how are we supposed to find enough food out here? Okay, I've cooked meals for 50 once or twice before. You got to coordinate, how much do I need? What's a serving? How long is it going to take? Well, 4,000? I'm going to need a kitchen crew. I'm going to need an industrial kitchen. I'm going to need all day to feed 4,000 people. And I only have 12 servers, maybe. Just think of the supplies you're going to need to feed 4,000 people. And you're out in the wilderness. There's no food truck. There's no Sam's Club. There's no restaurant depot. How on earth? This is a valid question. How are we supposed to find enough food out here? Jesus, I know you want to feed them, but there ain't no store around. What are you trying to do? And Jesus asks, how much bread do you have? And they say 7 loaves. So Jesus didn't create a fast food restaurant, is the term I use today in Bible study. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. We're going to have a sit-down meal. That's a deeper meal than just, here's your food, have a nice day. So he really cared about the people. Something else I wanted to, and I had to ask a specific question to get the students to see this in the study today was, I said, what can we learn about Jesus? Or what did he did specifically in verse 6 that if you're a non-Christian, you might wonder, why would Jesus do this? So as we got into it, someone finally read it, and they said he took 7 loaves. He thanked God for the 7 loaves. So we were talking about, where do we get the idea to pray for our meals? How many people here pray before their meals? But why would Jesus pray to God? He does it all over the scriptures. And talking to Muslims once in my ministry, I had a student come up and say, if Jesus was God, why would he pray to himself? A valid question. If you're not of the faith, it's a valid question. And so I think he did it to model what we're supposed to do. He didn't just say, here's the food, boom. He said, here's the food we got. God, thank you for this food. Multiply it. He then broke it into pieces, gave it to the disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. And it's almost like the bread was the appetizer, because then a few fish were found. So too, Jesus then, so it's a separate blessing almost. It is the way we're wording this passage. He then blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. So questions that got brought up today is, how long would it take the disciples? Now, is it just the 12? Is it the 72? How long would it take them to serve food to at least 4,000 people? Now, picture yourself as one of the disciples. You're getting food. You're like, we gave him 7 loaves. I got a basket I'm taking. Where do you get it from? Walking 100 feet, giving it to a little group, coming back and thinking, Jesus told all these people to sit down. I'm serving them, and they're going to get mad at me because I told them to sit down to eat, and there's not going to be enough food. And so somehow, and this was one of the questions, we had a fun discussion on this. How did it happen? Did loaves just appear? One person was like, was it manna? Did they just fall from the sky? Now, I don't think that one is right, but how was it? Was he like in his hands in a bowl and he just started breaking the bread off and the bread never got smaller? Same with the few small fish. How did the actual miracle happen? What goes through some of the students' heads this morning is, like, if you were able to watch, what would have happened? And then we also talked about, what would you have thought of? Let's say you're in the back of the crowd and you're hungry. You got your family. It's been 3 days, and you're just like, oh, man, this has been great. We got a life we got to go back to. We dropped everything to come and find out about this guy. And now he's telling us to sit down and eat. Is he bringing food trucks in? Like, is there a catering service? Like, what does he mean he's going to feed us? What? Because the odds are, if you're in the crowd, you're just curious. You've heard about the wake, the commotion that this gentleman named Jesus has done. You've heard about the healings. You maybe have heard he fed 5,000 people. You may have heard he walked on water. You may have heard that he questioned the spiritual judgmental leaders. He did all these things, and people are just telling him, and enough so that it's like he tweeted and 5,000 people saw it. Like, the word was faster than any social media we could think about. That there isn't any social media, and yet somehow the curiosity of this gentleman sparked so much interest that families and gentlemen would leave everything to do and drop it just to go find out more. Pretty cool. So we learned that Jesus was curious. People were very curious as to who this person was. And we see that he thanked God for things beforehand. And Jesus met their need, and then he was done. Verse 10, immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples, crossed over to the region, to another spot. So Jesus also has patience, something that we pointed out. Verse 8, it says they ran out of food again. We already fed 5,000 people, and the disciples were like, Jesus, what are we supposed to do? And now Jesus is saying, hey, guys, what should we do? I'd like to feed them. And he's testing them. Do they remember what they did? Do they realize that they have, or soon are going to have, the power to do some of these miracles? So those are the majority of the things we talked about in question number 2. Now, question number 3 is, what can we learn? How can we be encouraged? What can we learn to apply? Kind of that type of question for number 3. Things that were brought up where God cares not just about our spiritual needs, but he also cares about our physical needs. He cares that we're fed. And one thing we got in, which was pretty cool, verse 8, they ate as much as they wanted. Think about that. Think about in the physical realm. You're hungry, you're out in the wilderness, and you're not just given. I've been on camping trips with my dad. You'd have ramen noodles and a piece of bread for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, not always, but, sometimes when you're out in the wilderness or camping, it's kind of what I'm thinking. You don't always have a full meal. You don't always eat as much as you want. You're limited. And so in that area, Jesus didn't just meet their need, the basics. They ate as much as they wanted. He overflowed their need, and that was refreshing to us. Jesus has patience because it happened again. So we need to remember that not to feel guilt and shame, or at least not let them distract us and drive them away from Christ. To remember that, man, we're imperfect human beings. And Christ is going to be patient with us, just like he was with his disciples. They'd already done this, but he still had to go over the basics with them. I just mentioned that, so Jesus met their needs and overabundant them. And I mentioned I have one student in particular at the Bible study that has a huge hunger and thirst for God's word. Memorizes scripture weekly, just digging in, asking questions. She is growing in awesome ways. I'm excited to see what God's going to do to her. But she has such a thirst. And so I said to her, have you ever been in a buffet line or at a graduation party or something, and you get up to go to the food line and you realize almost all the food's gone? And she was like, yes, that's no fun. And I said, but at this party that Jesus threw, there was more than you could ever want, right? There was extra. And so in the spiritual realm, he also cares about the spiritual food, and he's the giver of the spiritual food. And so I said to her, have you ever been to a Bible study or a church service and you felt like the food wasn't there, or it was just spiritual milk? And she totally had felt that at certain Bible studies in different places where she's going and excited to dig in deep, and they talk about one verse and then they go play games. And so my encouragement was that in the same way that he met their need physically with a hunger, when we are hungry and thirsty for spiritual food, he won't just give us a verse. He will give us everything we need and more to encourage us and comfort us. Trying to think if there was anything else that we kind of talked about. What else do I got in my notes? Oh, one of the questions we always are encourage any random question. Someone asked, when were people first called Christians? And so I quickly looked up Acts 11:26. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. So that was another thing just that got brought up in our study today. So that's Mark chapter 8, just the first little section where Jesus feeds 4,000. And he's teaching his disciples some things to remember to have faith. Remember what God has done in the past, and he will be faithful to do it again now and in the future. So thanks for joining us on our Bible study recap on Mark chapter 8 with Campus 180 Ministries, and we hope you'll check back in next week as we continue along in our study of Mark. Have a blessed day.